Well, let's go ahead and begin. Welcome to the Quincy Institute's discussion today. We've got a big audience to join our discussion, which is entitled Taps for America's Empire of Bases, Reducing the US Global Bootprint. We're going to have an overdue conversation about why it is that the United States rings the globe with military bases and why US officials might want to change course. My name is Stephen Wertheim. I direct Grand Strategy here at the Quincy Institute for Responsible Statecraft. We're a transpartisan think tank founded in 2019 with a mission to promote ideas to move US foreign policy away from endless war and toward vigorous diplomacy in the pursuit of peace. It always sounds pretty good to me. And I am delighted to introduce three speakers who will give us a range of perspectives on America's overseas bases. First, we are delighted to have David Vine. He is a professor of political anthropology at American University. David has recently published a book I heartily recommend to you. It is entitled The United States of War, A Global History of America's Endless Conflicts from Columbus to the Islamic States. David is a co-founder of the Overseas Base Realignment and Closure Coalition, which just last week published an open letter calling on the Biden administration to commence a round of base closures. I am also very pleased to introduce Christina An. She is the executive director of Women Cross DMZ, a global movement of women mobilizing to end the Korean War. She has organized peace and humanitarian aid delegations to North and South Korea, and she is the recipient of the 2020 U.S. Peace Prize, awarded for bold activism to end the Korean War, heal its wounds, and promote women's roles in building peace. Delighted to have her, and we are joined by John Glazer, the Director of Foreign Policy Studies at the Cato Institute. He writes incisively on a range of issues in U.S. strategy, and he published a Cato policy analysis entitled Withdrawing from Overseas Bases, Why a Forward Deployed Military Posture is Unnecessary, Outdated, and Dangerous. Otherwise, he thinks it's pretty good. I also want to plug his podcast, one of my favorites. It's called Power Problems, and I recommend his latest book, co-written with two colleagues, called Fuel to the Fire: How Trump Made America's Broken Foreign Policy Even Worse, and How We Can Recover. So this is going to be good. And to make it even better, the president of the Quincy Institute, none other than Andrew Bacevich, will moderate the discussion. Andrew needs no introduction, but I'll just say that he is Professor Emeritus of International Relations and History at Boston University. His latest book is The Age of Illusions: How America Squandered Its Cold War Victory. And soon he will come out with a marvelous new book, which I've gotten a sneak peek at, reflecting on the pandemic and the interlocking crises of our present moment. And there is a final participant today, and that is you. Please ask questions in the midst of our discussion. If you're joining us via Zoom, use the Q&A function to type your question, and do that at any point in the conversation, and you may hear your question asked. And if you're watching via Facebook, please use the comments tool there to submit your questions. So that is more than enough for me. Please welcome Andrew Bacevich. Please take it away.
Well, thank you for that rousing introduction. I think Stephen's got a second career ahead, perhaps. As Stephen mentioned, our subject is America's overseas presence, a prominent expression of basic U.S. national security policy for decades now. The purpose of this event is to discuss potential adjustments to that overseas presence. It is not our purpose over the course of 1 hour to reach any concrete conclusions to which we will all agree, but rather to try to promote a conversation, a badly needed conversation about this particular subject. I'd like to jump right into the proceedings. In doing that, I'll pose the first question for David. David, if you would, please remind us about the scope of this empire of bases and talk a little bit about how it came into existence, and perhaps in particular, how it has changed over time, particularly since the end of the Cold War. David Vine.
Sure. First, let me just thank you, Andy. I really appreciate it, and Stephen, and everyone at the Quincy Institute for putting this event on. Laura Lumpy, Sam Fraser. There couldn't be a more appropriate setting, even if on Zoom, to have this conversation, given the transpartisan nature of the Quincy Institute. I also do want to thank the transpartisan group that has been part of that wrote and has disseminated the letter that Stephen mentioned, the Overseas-Based Realignment and Closure Coalition, many whose members made this event possible, beginning with Leah Bolger, Medea Benjamin, Larry Wilkerson, John Tierney, and Eugene Goltz. So I want to thank all of them. I feel very lucky to have been a part of that group. At the time, it's felt like one of those bad jokes about a priest, a rabbi, and a minister going into a bar, except our group is more like the Koch Foundation, the Cato Institute, Code Pink, and Noam Chomsky walk into a bar. So anyway, but wanted to liven things up. Just to answer, Andy, your very important question about this empire of bases. That word empire is appropriate because the United States currently, and really since World War II, has possessed a collection of overseas military bases that's larger than that of any people, country, nation, or empire in world history. I'll just share a map that will give people a sense of what the current collection of military bases abroad looks like. Around 800 US bases outside the 50 states in Washington, DC, in actually more than 80 countries. So around 800 bases in more than 80 countries and colonies. This is a collection, as many know, that really grew up during World War II and the early days of the Cold War. The US has had bases abroad really since independence, but the vast majority of bases that we see today emerge during World War II, occupied during World War II, or were built, constructed during the Cold War. The early days of the Cold War, and then beginning in 1980 in the greater Middle East, also during the first Gulf War, and in the post 9/11 period, again in the greater Middle East. But we do see new bases in Central and Eastern Europe, in parts of Asia, and especially in Africa. So just to your last question, the collection of bases has changed since the Cold War. The total number of bases is actually about half the number at the end of the Cold War. There were about 1,600 bases at the end of the Cold War. Today, around 800. But the total number of countries occupied by US bases has actually doubled. There were about 1,600 bases in 40 countries at the end of the Cold War. Today, around 800 bases in more than 80 countries and colonies.
So very quickly, before we go to John, what do you attribute the change? The change from 40 countries to 80 countries. What's driving this?
I think, in short, the military is looking for things to do. I think we should pay attention to the way in which the total number has decreased. That is important because it shows that we can close bases abroad. There were large numbers of closures after the end of the Cold War. And then again, particularly during the George W. Bush administration, actually at the time that the Bush administration was building new bases in the Middle East as part of the US wars in Iraq and Afghanistan and far beyond. But the military has been looking for things to do and has been given a budget that has reached heights not seen during the height of the Cold War. And if you've got that much money, you find ways to do things with it. And building new bases has been one of the ways. I think the other explanation is that amid rising competition with China, the US government has decided to use military force, military bases, and other forms of military engagement as one of the tools to win friends and keep other countries within an umbrella to compete against China. And I think the record shows this has been a pretty poor use of US taxpayer dollars. And it is important to point out, many people don't really think much about US bases abroad, don't know what they look like. Vast majority of bases look like this. It's helpful to know. This base is actually Guantanamo Bay. People think of the prison, but vast majority of the base at Guantanamo Bay looks like a not so small US American town. And this is costing taxpayers around $51.5 billion a year.
John, let's turn to you. In your estimation, how do US bases abroad contribute to US national security policy? I mean, to what degree are they helpful? To what degree are they harmful? My understanding is that the logic of this presence relates to the idea of a forward presence, of positioning US forces in strategically important places. Does that concept remain valid? And if not, why not?
Yeah, I have been able to narrow down the strategic justifications for our overseas presence, these forward deployed bases, to 3 items, essentially. We want to deter adversaries, we want to reassure allies, and then the third one is contingency responsiveness. We want to be able to rapidly deploy into any region very fast in order to deal with a live situation. And the problem is that those are often not how things actually work. So we deter adversaries arguably sometimes by our bases, but other times we create animosity and fear and cause them to lash out. So think of our growing presence in Europe, which technically the troop levels, as David mentioned, have gone down since the Cold War, but bases have continued to expand and NATO members have expanded up to the Russian border in some cases. And it's hard to find anyone in Moscow that justifies Russia's incursions into Georgia and Ukraine without reference to the fact that US military bases are increasingly encroaching into their neighborhood. And so these often cause a kind of lashing out. If you think of the Cuban Missile Crisis, for example, that started because we had bases in Turkey right up next to the Soviet Union with, Jupiter missiles. And so they said, hey, you're near us, we'll go near you. And they started putting stuff in Cuba. So the deterrence thing is often very hard to demonstrate because you're talking about something that hasn't happened, but it's also backlashes, it backfires. Reassurance is problematic too. If you reassure allies, what you're really talking about is you're incentivizing them to spend less on their defense. And that's why America has to spend so much on its military, because we are also subsidizing the defense of at least 60 treaty nations that we're treaty bound to defend. And then the contingency responsiveness thing, this is kind of interesting. I mean, I don't know, if you view decision makers in the federal government as, benevolent and nearly omniscient, permitting them to have an empire of military bases to manage international relations and police the world, that kind of makes some sense. But if you're like me and you think those people are just people, and more than that, they're people in power who therefore must be subject to public scrutiny and to the imposition of constraints on the exercise of that power, then allowing them this mechanism of constant warfare is an abomination. I mean, as the scholar Bernard Brody used to say, one way of keeping people out of trouble is to deny them the means for getting into it. And I think if we want to tame the national security state and tame our global military empire, one way to do it would be to deny the federal government the military bases that in any case don't serve the US national interest, because I don't actually want them to be able to rapidly deploy in any situation conceivable. I want them to have to overcome certain things like a public debate, like a congressional vote. And then we can start thinking about moving bases. And I think that's okay because we're basically safe. We're not so threatened by rapacious, land-hungry conquerors around the world that we actually need this presence. We can roll back and remain safe.
I'm trying to remember when the last time I heard Bernard Brody quoted. That's kind of cool. But Christine, you're up. So the president has directed the Pentagon to undertake an assessment, as I understand it, of our global military posture. What do you expect from that? I mean, do you think this is a project that will result in substantive change, or is this something that's going to end up with a small amount of tinkering? And perhaps more than that, what kind of change would you like to see?
Well, thank you so much, Andrew, for those really great important questions, and also QI for involving me in this important conversation. I mean, I think we're seeing lots of things from the Biden administration. One is, a commitment to diplomacy and a commitment to end America's endless wars. At the same time, ramping up aggression towards China. We saw Blinken's major foreign policy speech, and he included lots of important points. And then number 9 was China, which included North Korea, Russia, and Iran. And so I don't see that forward posture changing much. But what I'd like to see, and what I think most Americans would like to see, is a drastic reduction of US militarism and bases around the world. I mean, we are at a historic moment where seen laid bare by the pandemic that all the crises that we face, whether it's climate change, whether it's this COVID, whether it's racism, it's not going to be resolved militarily. And that we need a fundamental reorientation of what makes us secure. And so I think when we think about how we're going to do this, I think it's really critical to bring in the perspectives of those people who live around the US bases. And so I've worked alongside, I've been at those places of resistance, whether it's been South Korea, on Jeju Island, in Pyeongtaek, or in Okinawa, or right here, even on occupied Hawaiian land. And I think that they present a view that says that there is violence at these bases before it's the site of violence, before there is a war, whether it's violence against coral reefs, against farmlands, against forests, against women's bodies around the US military camp towns. And so how do we bring in their perspectives? Because US bases are not benign. They are sites of violence, as I mentioned. One of the most transformative experiences I had was in 2006 when I traveled to South Korea, to Pyeongtaek, which is the world's largest military base. 3,500 acres. That's like 4 central parks. And that is 50 miles south of Seoul in Pyeongtaek. And these rice farmers were resisting the seizure of their land to accommodate the expansion of Camp Humphreys. And I witnessed Harmonies, the grandmothers, like tie themselves to the roofs of their homes to prevent them from being bulldozed. And so we see this time and time and again when we talk about the construction of a new base, the expansion, or even just the existing ones. It always leads to the devastation of the environment, the destruction of communities and livelihoods. I think we need to really bring in this perspective because it's not just about our security. And I really love John's point about, are these bases really making us more secure? I think the other point is, especially on the Korean Peninsula right now, where the US-South Korea war drills are taking place, it's also the site of provocation. These war drills are considered like routine. Well, in fact, they have historically included B-2 bombers, nuclear aircraft carriers, and submarines that fly perilously close to the North Korean border. And, studies have shown that, these are not actually deterring North Korea. It's actually provoking them and inciting them. And so I do think that it's time to have a hard look about what these bases are doing to impact our security at home. And just finally, to your question about, what can we expect? And I think this is a question actually for all of us and for all of the movements that we are a part of. Can we really imagine a formidable anti-war and peace movement that is willing to cross partisan lines, as is being done here, or willing to cross our silos to recognize that we have to eliminate the binary between domestic and foreign policy? I think that is on us. And I do believe that we can and we must do that because there really is no other path forward.
Let me ask you to pivot back to the narrower question of bases just for a moment. And your remarks focused primarily on the Korean Peninsula, not entirely, but primarily on the Korean Peninsula. And I guess my question for you uh, is this an all or nothing issue? That is to say, should we go from 800 bases scattered around in 80 countries to no bases anywhere? Or, in your judgment, would it make sense for us to draw down our presence in some parts of the world, but maintain a US military presence in other parts of the world? I'd like you to just reflect on that a little bit.
Really great and important question. And I will bring it back to the Korean Peninsula, which I am most familiar with. And I think that there's a big debate, obviously, in South Korea and among the civil society and the peace movements about what is the right number, when is the right time. And I think that should be a democratic process that involves the civil society of both, and especially the civil society in South Korea. But we've had up to 250,000 US troops in Korea. And yes, that was definitely in the aftermath of war. But we've seen the progressive decline. So we have 28,000 troops in South Korea. What would be the difference of 14,000? And as we know, in the last decade or two, we've seen incredible reconciliation take place between the North and the South Koreans. In 2018, we saw Kim Jong-un and Moon Jae-in negotiate the Panmunjom Declaration, where they've committed to transforming the Korean Peninsula into a land of peace. And so that begs the question then, what is going to be the role of the US forces on the Korean Peninsula? And I think it's all patently clear that it's there to project power against China. And so what does that mean for the people of the Korean Peninsula to be caught in the crossfire? Not just the Korean Peninsula, Okinawa, Guam, Hawaii, to be caught between this great power competition. I don't think none of the people of those various countries want to be or see a vision laid out, whether it's the US or China vision. I think they want a free and independent, sovereign and neutral territory. And I do think that it's a moment where these civil society movements have to beg the question, what does that mean then? Does it mean a new non-aligned movement for the 21st century that refuses to be allied with either side?
Could I say one thing about this Biden administration review?
Oh, please.
I don't know what the results will be, but if let's say they're open to at least making some changes, if they decide, we don't need as many bases as we currently have, we can just reduce them. That I worry about, because that's essentially a way of saying we can make our current strategy cheaper and more efficient. At the end of the day, overseas bases are merely a physical manifestation of the strategy that we pursue. So long as there's no change in strategy, so long as the Biden administration thinks we have to defend security clients that are irrelevant to our own security, or, provide global public goods, or manage all manner of international disputes and discipline rogue states and so on, you need an empire of military bases to do that somewhat effectively. And so the strategy is what needs to change. And then I think we'll come closer to seeing the obsolescence of bases. One other quick point on that: in a situation of changing technology and changing dynamics in international relations, the military base per se doesn't have the same pull as it used to. It doesn't have the same impact on the way states perceive relations. And so we need to think about whether or not bases are just out of date in terms of a tool of US foreign policy.
So I interpret that as suggesting that you want to bring them all home. Go from 800 to 0. Obviously not overnight. It has to be done in a sensible way over time. But from your perspective, U.S. national security would benefit, and I guess global stability would benefit from bringing all of the troops home.
I do. Yeah. I mean, things might change. You might have, European states, spending more on defense, or Asian states spending more on defense to
Well,
accommodate.
what risks? And I'm not asking you to argue against your own position, but what risks might that end of the U.S. foreign presence entail?
Well, I think it's different in different places. I think in Europe, it'll largely be pacifying because Europe is a very rich, capable, militarily capable, that is, region. And we're not doing much in terms of protecting them or stabilizing that area. Things are a little less clear in Asia, I think. With the rise of China, there's increasing worry and fears about security. But the same technologies that are allowing China to deny American access to their near abroad are apply to the Asian states, and they can build those up too. So I think it's basically safe, and the reason is because the world is under a state of defense dominance, as scholars like to put it. That is to say, the costs of offensive military action and conquest and invading other countries is so great that it outweighs most of the perceived benefits that even the most maniacal leaders tend to perceive. And so nuclear weapons, advanced military technology, economic interdependence, changing norms around war, all these things have an impact and are trending towards peace and less war. And that kind of allows us to back away.
David, where are you on this? Is it, bring them all home, or should the reduction of the U.S. Presence abroad be, regional? Keep the troops over here, bring them home from over there. How do you see it?
So, yeah, let me be clear. In my mind, we're not talking about the reduction of the U.S. presence abroad or the end of the U.S. presence abroad. We're talking about, in my mind, what I'd like to see is a different U.S. presence abroad, that we would draw down bases, return troops home, and build up the U.S. diplomatic presence abroad. That we can't just be talking about a sort of zero-sum game, but instead
let me interrupt by saying you
Sure.
are singing the QI's tune here, okay?
And
less war, more diplomacy. But go ahead.
Yeah, no, and happily we've heard similar things from the Biden administration. So I'm incredibly optimistic about the global posture review. I think this is a tremendous opportunity, really historic opportunity, and long overdue, to change the nature of U.S. engagement with the rest of the world and change the U.S. presence around the world. When we must seize it. And there are very good signs that this sort of transformation will happen. None other than the chair of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, Mark Milley, the highest ranking officer in the US military, has said we need to take a hard look at US infrastructure abroad. He said, I think we have too much infrastructure overseas. Chair of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, I think we have too much infrastructure overseas. He said, is every one of these bases absolutely positively necessary for the defense of the United States? I think he's clearly come to the conclusion, as have people across the political spectrum, including within the military, come to the conclusion that these clearly are not. And that, in fact, this huge infrastructure of bases abroad is, in a whole variety of ways, undermining the security of people in the United States. And as Christine so eloquently pointed out, is it undermining the security of people around the world. So we really must seize this opportunity.
Christine, do you share David's optimism on that score?
Well, yes. And I mean, back to Korea, a little bit no. And I know that the Biden administration is currently going through a North Korea policy review, and I know Blinken will be in South Korea next week. But I mean, first, to the point that David makes so clearly, I'm channeling Ann Wright, the former retired U.S. Army colonel, when she reminds that that we have no need to have these bases because of the quick deployment by aircraft of U.S. troops wherever they need to go. But secondly, that in every embassy, and back to David's point about what are we trying to strengthen in terms of U.S. presence around the world. So around every U.S. military base, embassy in every country, there is a defense attaché who can communicate. And you know that, Andrew, from having served in the military. And so I think that that's a very pragmatic point. But to the point about what is going to improve American security. And I think back to the Korean conflict, instead of investing so much money in maintaining 28,000 US troops in South Korea and these very costly provocative war drills that the US conducts with South Korea, what about a very inexpensive solution, which is a peace first approach? We know that 30 years of US maximum pressure campaign, whether in the form of sanctions, political isolation, and these provocative war games, have not achieved US goals, which is the denuclearization of the Korean Peninsula or North Korea. And instead, what if we had a new approach, which was a peace first approach? We actually do what we committed to doing 70 years ago when we negotiated the armistice and the ceasefire with North Korea, which was we would sit down and negotiate a peace settlement. And that is yet to be done. And what if we shifted, instead of having a provocative, aggressive posture towards China, towards North Korea, and actually had a diplomatic first approach? I think that we would have much more progress and seeing the improvement of human rights and actually seeing progress towards denuclearization on the Korean Peninsula.
So we've been talking a lot about Korea, Asia Pacific, talked a little bit about Europe. I want to shift the conversation to the Middle East, Persian Gulf, and Africa. We got a question from Gordon Adams. I'll read exactly what he says. What has been the role of the global war on violent extremism? That used to be the global war on terrorism. What has been the role of the global war on violent extremism in leading the military to expand bases in places like Africa and the Middle East? And I think implicit in Gordon's question is, does that make sense? Or is Africa and the Middle East a place that ought to be included in any reduction of the U.S. military presence abroad? Who would like to take that on? David?
I would like to take that on, in part to correct something I said earlier about the military looking for things to do, and that being part of the explanation for why the total number of countries occupied by US bases has doubled since the end of the Cold War. Gordon Adams, of course, is exactly right that many of the bases we see today and the spread of bases to new countries is a result of this long series of endless wars we've seen since October 2001. And the track record has been, to put it mildly, catastrophic. The damage that has been done in Iraq, Afghanistan, Pakistan, Yemen, Somalia, and Syria, Philippines, on and on, is really horrific and in ways that I think most people in the United States have not grappled with. And one of the products of these wars has been this expansion in the number of bases, this infrastructure that really undergirds the endless wars. And that if we're going to bring the endless wars to an end, we need to dismantle this infrastructure of bases, and beginning in the greater Middle East. It's also important to point out that, of course, in the Persian Gulf, we're talking about US bases in undemocratic countries ruled by often dictatorial, violent regimes, beginning with Saudi Arabia. Why does the United States have bases in Saudi Arabia? As part of changing that relationship fundamentally, we should remove all the bases from, in my mind, Saudi Arabia and any country where US bases are propping up undemocratic regimes. Similarly, in Africa, the track record of the Africa Command and the construction of bases and the increase in the number of US troops in Africa has been pretty disastrous. And frequently, as has been the case in the Middle East, has actually helped with the recruitment by militant groups that would use terrorist techniques and actions to achieve their ends. That the presence of US bases and troops, just as it did with bin Laden, has actually been a tool to recruit people and been the source of grievances that has made the world more violent.
A question from Mark Harrison, who who makes the point, which I think is an accurate point, that in at least some of the countries where we maintain foreign bases, the government wants us to stay. I think that's true in Germany. Christine, you'll know better than I do, but I think that may be true in South Korea. It's certainly true in places like Poland. What do we make of that? And how should the fact that they want us there militarily, how should that factor into thinking about this larger issue? John, you want to take that on?
Sure. I mean, it's not that hard to explain, I think. If you go to a country that's not as rich and powerful as you, and you say, look, if you let us put a military base in your country, well, basically, that comes along with a security guarantee. That comes along with us saying, we will take care of your security. And so that's extremely good news to a government. They can not burden their taxpayers with more taxes. They can devote more money to social welfare. It's a good deal for the people and a good deal for the government. And so a lot of times that is the explanation, although, the people often resent it. And that doesn't translate often. So if you think about Okinawa, such an overwhelming opposition to the US-based presence there. And the Japanese government is democratic, but it would rather have the subsidy of US defense procurement, One thing with regard to the Middle East, certainly it's the case that a lot of people in the Middle East don't appreciate the United States military presence there. But two things have been massively exaggerated in order to permit what David talked about, this expansion of our presence in the post 9/11 era there. And those two things are, number one, the geopolitical importance of this region for the United States. That has been massively inflated. It's not that important. It represents about 3.5% of global GDP, mostly a poor region where the states in question can't, leap over the oceans to attack us. It's just not that important. The oil question, we don't do much by being there. The claim is that we pacify the region with the presence there and therefore permit a free flow of oil. But it's in the interest of all the states in the region to get oil through the Strait of Hormuz without trouble. And, oil is a fungible commodity traded on global markets and subject to the law of supply and demand. And US military really has very little to do with where it goes and for how much it's sold. The second thing that's been massively exaggerated is the threat. What threat do we face from the Middle East? One would come up with the first one, I think, is terrorism. That's really not a major threat, certainly not one that justifies dozens and dozens of military bases and up to 60,000 troops there permanently. Roughly on a permanent basis. And, since 9/11, about 6 people per year on average each year, if you average it out, die of terrorism. That's teensy compared to virtually every other cause of death that we have in this country. And the fact that we've spent so much money battling a threat that is relatively minor should be astonishing to people. That 9/11 was not a harbinger of things to come. It was a darn lucky shot by a bunch of scoundrels. And we shouldn't have interpreted it as a harbinger that required lots of military action to prevent a second one.
Christine, could we take up this question of government support as it applies to the case of South Korea?
Yeah, I mean, this notion that the governments want to maintain the U.S. bases, I think that's a very complicated question. And there's a lot of negotiations that take place, I think, between governments. I think about the period of 2007. So back to the Pyeongtaek military base. I mean, part of that expansion was because the U.S. role on the Korean Peninsula was shifting. North and South Korea is beginning in 2000 with the Sunshine Policy between Kim Dae-jung and Kim Jong-il, began a process of reconciliation. They were reuniting families. They were doing joint economic ventures. That was the creation of Kaesong at the DMZ. And so it became kind of clear that the US role on the peninsula was no longer the same one as it was in 1953 when the Korean War ended. And so what Roh Moo-hyun did at the time was made an agreement with the United States to agree to expand Camp Humphreys and agree to send South Korean troops as part of the coalition of the willing to the invasion of Iraq in exchange for allowing reconciliation between North and South Korea. And here we are in 2021 in an almost exact same dynamic. Moon Jae-in has requested that the Biden administration, they wanted to cancel the military exercises that are taking place because they see that as provocative. They see that as an obstacle towards diplomacy with North Korea. And so somehow the bases and their ongoing presence creates this kind of stuck in the mud. It's like this status quo that doesn't allow for shifting in postures and policies. And I want to bring in the perspective of people that have to live with the consequences of US bases and militarism, because those costs are hidden. I mean, think about, many Americans don't know this, but Agent Orange was actually stored in South Korea that wasn't used during the Vietnam War. Well, what do you think happens when they're stored for decades, on the land? Like, it seeps into the soil, it contaminates the water. What are these like massive hidden costs of all this contamination, all this violence that is committed on and around these spaces? I think it's a moral calculus. And when we factor that into what this country is needing at this moment to get out of the multiple crises that we are facing, I think the question is clear. It's time to bring the troops home. It's time to close and end our global military footprint and radically reorient how we are willing to engage with the rest of the world.
Could I add just one quick thing to what you said? It's an add-on example, because if you think of Uzbekistan, in order to conduct the war in Afghanistan, the United States military wanted a northern route to Afghanistan, and Uzbekistan was a good candidate. In order to keep our bases there, the government basically said, you can't criticize us on the world stage. And when the Obama administration actually did get a little tough in their rhetoric and started to criticize Uzbekistan for human rights abuses, they said, okay, your base is gone. That's the kind of political tug and pull that often happens. By the way, Uzbekistan was famous in the aughts for having a regime that used to boil people alive and do other unspeakable acts that I won't even utter here. Think about just a few weeks ago, I saw in the news, the Duterte government in the Philippines sent a message to the United States, which said, you're not paying us enough to have military bases here, right? So oftentimes it's in the regime's interest. They're playing some kind of political game in order to keep these bases there. And we need to keep that in mind too.
Let me just say on a personal note, I am an expert when it comes to the effects of Agent Orange. Got a question posed by my QI colleague, Michael Swain, but let me preface it. I think I would argue that the 800 bases are similar to all the aircraft carriers, are of a part with the massive nuclear strike force that we are modernizing, are a part of the penchant for interventionism, whether to go kill people or to exercise. That is to say that all of these things are part and parcel of our claim to primacy and greatness. These are the things that distinguish us from every other significant nation on the planet. Nobody else does these things, I guess with the exception of the Russians, have a lot of nukes. But this is what makes us stand out. So Michael Swain's question, what should be the new overall strategy, the new overall US strategy that would permit a major US base reduction? In other words, he's saying we can't just say we're all going home. The troops are going home. The troops are going home, and here now is what defines US strategy without militarism. So I'd like to hear you all reflect on that. We don't have a heck of a lot of time left. David, can you start us off? And then we'll go to Christine, and then we'll go to John.
Sure, it's a big and critical question. I think what needs to define U.S. engagement with the world is the advancement of peace and the advancement of the diplomatic solution of the world's problems. Andy, I think you've said something to this effect. Why isn't peace the center point of our foreign policy? Peace, the advancement of peace and diplomacy, and that's why I'm really calling for drawing down while building up, drawing down bases and troops while building up diplomatic presence, diplomatic assets around the world, and diplomatic engagement. Similarly, I think a foreign policy focused on what I sometimes refer to as a human politique, a foreign policy that would be first and foremost focused on the human impacts of foreign policy decisions.
Christine, your thoughts on what would be the basis of U.S. grand strategy if we chose not to be the greatest military power on the planet?
I just want to echo what David said. What about a peace first approach? And that is so clear in the case of North Korea that, 30, 70 years of sanctions and isolation and military provocation has not worked. It has not achieved U.S. policy goals of achieving denuclearization of the Korean Peninsula. It has not achieved improvement in human rights. Why don't we try a fundamentally different approach? And so that's why, my group, part of a transnational feminist campaign, released a new report called Path to Peace, where we make the case for a peace agreement to end the Korean War. I think that would have amazing rippling effects. If North and South Korea were able to make peace, with North Korea and the US to make peace, how would that change the calculus in the great power competition between the US and China? I think that the world's people would love to see a path forward that wasn't about provocation, that wasn't about aggression, that wasn't about more militarization. And we constantly use the vilification of North Korea or China to justify more militarization. And I think that's part of the question that we need to be asking ourselves. What makes us secure? Is it clean water? Is it food? Is it homes? Is it jobs? Is it, a clean environment? I think these are the questions that we need to fundamentally ask ourselves. And I think the US could be a leader in promoting those values around the world. But we do need a peace first diplomacy replacing the aggressive militarization that we have wreaked all around the world.
John, what's your view? What's the alternative to militarism as a basis of grand strategy?
Well, fortunately for policymakers, there's been a decades-long debate about this in international relations. And scholars have put forth a lot of proposals. There are strategic alternatives to the one that we currently pursue. My preference is for a grand strategy that is often called restraint. This defines U.S. national interests rather narrowly. It's basically, I view it as a call to be a normal country, to have the foreign policy of a normal country, and not one that is exceptional, hubristic, and possessing special responsibilities around the globe.
John, I have to interrupt.
Sure.
And I apologize. Will our fellow citizens accept the notion of the United States of America being a normal country?
Well, they might not like my terminology. Yeah, there is a lot of pride in our quote unquote exceptionalism, but I don't think that needs to manifest in violence and military dominance. The core of the current strategy that we currently pursue is a simple notion It's got very little support in academia. I don't think that the theory bears itself out, but it's called hegemonic stability theory. The idea is the world is a safer and more peaceful and more stable place with one dominant military that can basically police and shape the order. And that's a claim, and it doesn't have a lot of support. And the core thing I think that we need to get back to an alternative that is sensible is you need to ask the right questions. What traditional security threats do we currently face? The United States is probably the safest nation in the world. We have two great moats, oceans to our east and west, which serve as defensive barriers to most kinds of conventional military threats. We have a nuclear deterrent, one of the richest countries in the world, a massive military, lots of influence with allies all around the world. We don't have any great powers in our own hemisphere. I mean, we are extremely safe. And all of these extracurricular activities that we do around the world are not about defending the United States. I don't think it's a radical notion. I don't think Americans should consider it a radical notion that the US military's job is to protect the United States and its citizens and not the entire world.
Question from oops, I'm sorry, David, do you want to comment on that?
Sure. I mean, just to echo John, I mean, we are extraordinarily safe in many ways, but then of course we look at COVID and, more than 500,000 people dead in a year. We have not protected people in the United States. If we look at, how many people are sleeping on the streets every night, how many children are sleeping on the streets every night, how many children are going to school every day in just decrepit, crumbling schools. We look at our infrastructure from Texas to nationwide. While we have this very robust infrastructure of bases around the world that have drained money from the actual needs and security of people in the United States and around the world. I think we need only go back to the language of President Eisenhower. He called military spending what it is, a theft from the real needs of human beings. And that's why we need such a dramatic transformation in our foreign and domestic policy. And I really think there is an opportunity to achieve that sort of radical transformation and reset of our foreign policy and domestic policy.
Okay, we've only got like 5 minutes left. I want to give the three of you a chance to make a brief closing statement, each one of you. But before that, I want to go to a question. This is going to be right back to you, David. A question from Edward Grant, who asks whether the Pentagon can actually conduct an unbiased review of our base structures. General Milley seems to indicate he's interested in that. But one could easily imagine bureaucratic politics getting in the way. And Edward Grant says, wouldn't it be better to have an independent, nonpartisan commission take up this issue? Very quickly on that, please. And then I'm going to run through all three of you to give you a chance to wrap it up. David.
The answer in short is no. Indeed, the Pentagon can't be trusted to, in an unbiased way, conduct such an assessment. I'm not sure an independent, nonpartisan commission is the way to go. I think the Biden administration should, as it is showing leadership in other realms, just simply say, this is what we're doing. We are closing these bases after evaluating carefully and analyzing carefully the need for every single base abroad. Any base abroad that is not needed, and I think most of them are not, should be closed because it is undermining US and international security.
Good. Okay. Christine, can we ask you to be the lead off in offering any closing thoughts before we finish?
Well, this is very unconventional, but I wanted to share a quote from the village leader from when he was imprisoned for protesting against the expansion of Camp Humphreys. And I just think this really captures beautifully what we're discussing. And so when he was asked by the South Korean Defense Ministry the price for his land, this was his reply. The price will be unimaginably high. The price must include every grain of rice grown and harvested here. It must include all of our efforts to grow them, as well as our whole life here. including our sighs, our tears, and our laughter. The price must include the stars which have witnessed our grief and joy, and the wind which has dried all our tears. If all of these could be added, I would tell you the price. And I end with that quote because I think it is about these places of resistance to U.S. bases, that is about their humanity, their quest for freedom, for independence, and that we have a chance in this historic moment to advance their pleas for peace, and at the same time improve our security and the security that we are trying to redefine, that David talks about, when we don't have even a functioning healthcare system that could deal with COVID. And that, yeah, it's time to reorient our US foreign policy so that we can have true security at home.
John, closing thoughts.
You know, bases backfire. They entangle us in other people's conflicts. They incentivize reckless driving. They undermine our values because they end up making us supporting dictatorships. They cost a heck of a lot of money. And they don't even really serve the stated purposes. And so, you know, I'm not sure of the best mechanism, whether it's an independent commission or what, but we need to continue to ask questions about the utility of these bases and make sure to put it in the context of the very necessary debate on grand strategy that we have to have. As long as the strategy stays the same, we are going to have a decidedly interventionist foreign policy, regardless of the specific number of bases we have abroad.
David, you get the last word. You only got about a minute or so, but please give us your closing thoughts.
Sure. I think I just want to, again, remind people of what we're talking about here, and remind people that we're talking about the freedom and independence of people who live around US bases abroad, this huge collection of 800 bases abroad. We're also talking about the freedom of independence of people here in the United States. That again, this is a theft from all of us, and we shouldn't treat these bases as just part of the background. And, you know, I pointed to the Biden administration having an opportunity to fundamentally transform US foreign policy and how the US engages with the world. The Biden administration doesn't have to do this alone. There are people across the political spectrum who agree with the people who've spoken here today. This is not just a left-wing perspective. And I think the Biden administration can really proceed in a transpartisan manner to transform, to close bases abroad, build up diplomatic presence abroad and diplomacy and alliances, and again, fundamentally reset US foreign and, by extension, domestic policy.
Well, let me thank all three of you for joining us today. I have found the discussion to be most instructive. I'm very grateful. And at this point, I'm going to throw things back to Stephen to close out the event.
Thank you very much indeed. It has been an enriching conversation, and I know I learned a great deal from each of our panelists. So I want to thank all of them, as well as the hundreds of attendees who joined us live. I'm going to answer one more audience question. Charlotte Otto asked, is there a link to the open letter calling for base closures referenced at the beginning of the panel? And there is, and I'm going to give it to you verbally. It's very simple. Overseasbases.net. Overseasbases.net. You can go there to see the open letter and learn more about America's overseas bases and the coalition to review and close them that David leads. And if you haven't already, what are you waiting for? Sign up for the Quincy Institute mailing list. You can do that right now, as soon as you visit overseasbases.net by going to another website, quincyinst.org. That's quincyinst.org. That way you'll be notified of all of our events, because there's plenty more to come. So thank you very much again for joining us today, and look forward to seeing you next time.
Thank you. Thank you, Andrew.
Thank you so much, Stephen.
Hey, you guys were